So before I hand over to Rachel Garfield, our chair for this afternoon's activities, I wanted to say thank you to Aphra for bringing this wonderful exhibition to Wolverhampton. As many of you know, Anwar Jalal Shemza lived for many years in the local area, as well as teaching in Wombourne and Stafford. Indeed, we've welcomed many of his ex-students into the gallery over the past few months who are very proud to have the opportunity to be taught by Anwar. We are also fortunate to have 4 of his works within our collection. Being able to showcase these works alongside the artwork from the family's estate in this interactive digital exhibition has been a complete privilege and a pleasure. Aphra's notion that art and artistic practices are accessible to everyone is a concept that influences everything we do at Wolverhampton. The feedback we've had from visitors has been fantastic, and it's been a truly amazing project to be involved with. Thank you also, Aphra, for organising this event today. We are very much looking forward to learning more about Anwar, his work, his legacy, his story, and his influence on art and artists in Britain. I will now hand over to Rachel Garfield, Professor of Fine Art at the Royal College of Art and our chair for this afternoon's event.
So, this is Anwar with some of his prints and drawings. So he was born in India in 1928, so obviously that was before partition. He went to the Mayo School of Art. He learnt calligraphy and miniature painting, which he drew on later in his work, which I think those of you who've seen it can probably see. In 1956, he came to England, and part of the reason why he came was because he wanted to go back to Pakistan, as it was a fairly new country at that point, and to teach and to give back to Pakistan. That was a period where, after partition and in a kind of post-colonial era, I think there was a lot of energy to kind of build the countries that were newly formed in that period. And that's what he wanted to do. He was already a celebrated, a celebrated artist in his own country at that point. And he had published novels as well. I think you can see some of the novels that he published in the glass cabinets in the gallery as well. So he was a man of quite a few different talents, which he put into his artwork. He had a design studio in Lahore as well. So he was quite successful already when he came to the UK. And he went to the Slade School of Art. And I think he found it quite difficult because there was quite a cultural clash, I would say. He applied for the New Contemporaries and didn't get in, which I think was quite a shock to him because he was already an established artist. There is an apocryphal story. Well, it's a real story, but it seems to be quite an important story in the narrative of his life about how he went to a talk that Gombrich gave, the very celebrated art historian at the time, Ernst Gombrich gave at the Slade, and it was about Islamic art. And it really upset him a lot because it was probably quite reductive about Islamic art, but he saw it as a very functionalist approach to what Islamic art might represent. So that caused quite a kind of turbulence in him in terms of what kind of art practice to make, and I think it changed him quite profoundly, and we can talk a bit more about that later if you like. So, sorry, here's the slide. So that's, and the story of art is still in print. It's a very, he's known to be a very important art historian, but he is very old-fashioned, I would think, and a lot of the way that he approached art history is now very much being criticised and overtaken by post-colonial discourses and indeed other ways of reading art and thinking about what art practice might be. So, after he finished his degree, he got a scholarship to study under Anthony Gross, who was quite an important printmaker at the time. I think printmaking in the 1950s probably had a much more important role within art practice than it has now. And he learnt, he was a very inventive and very interesting printmaker, I think, if you actually look at his prints. They're made in some of the ways he made prints, you can't even, it's very hard to understand how he made them because he used such innovative and complex ways of putting the ink onto the paper. So, and they really are worth seeing in the flesh because they're much richer than they seem in reproduction, where you just see the graphic quality rather than the texture. Sorry, I'm an artist. I can't help but go off on about it. So he was a master printmaker, and he brought a lot of those visual techniques into his painting. Sorry, I'm talking about it the wrong way around because some of the artworks are in later slides. So he was involved as an artist in some what are probably quite peripheral galleries, but also very important in terms of contesting the canon, the so-called canon, because at that time the art world was run by very few men, and it was kind of probably it was quite difficult to get into the mainstream art world if you weren't part of that milieu, if you like. So Gallery 1 was a very important gallery in terms of the way it brought in different artists who might not have had mainstream attention. So, and the Gallery 1 was run by Victor Musgrove, who was a poet and a critic, and he was very supportive of artists of post-colonial heritage, as well as, you know, many artists from Britain as well. And he was particularly interested in abstract work as well. And the British art world was very conservative at the time, and it wasn't until probably the big American shows in 1956 and 1959 that abstraction really became mainstream. The British critics and the British dealers really resisted abstraction, and that's partly why there were these few galleries like Gallery 1 and the New Visions Gallery that really wanted to start to champion a kind of wider range of art practice. And part of the conversations were to do... Sorry, this is Anwar and Mary Shemza, who is the grandmother of Aphra here. And they were married throughout his life. And this is some of his work as well. So I thought it would be useful just to see some of the pamphlets from the shows. There's some of these in the cabinets in the gallery space as well. Where was I? Yeah, so there was quite a big battle in the 1950s between abstraction and figuration, and abstraction was seen to be very continental, it was seen to be international, it was seen to be communist, and there was a lot of debates about what is Englishness, what is English art, what is British art at the time. So people like Paul Nash and John Piper were very important and very key, and they were much more interested in a kind of neo-romanticism, in a certain idea of place and Englishness. Now, obviously, this was a place that would be quite difficult for someone like Shemza to inhabit in an unproblematic way because he wasn't born in England. But I argue, that he did engage with British landscape through a modernist lens, if you like. And that kind of combination of abstraction and this idea of place was very important to him. And I think one of the reasons why I talk about this is because I think it's quite destructive to position artists in a singular place. So they are this or they are that. And if you speak to any artist, that they draw their sources from all sorts of different places. Now, Shemza went back to Lahore. He was married and he had a baby at that point. And he went back to... Sorry, my mouth's dry. He went back to Lahore to do what he had intended to do. But he found they were there for 2 years, and he found it very, very difficult to make a living. So he came back to the UK and he went up to Stafford, which is where Mary, his wife, was from, and made a life there. And he taught in a school, and as some of us know, he was a very inspiring teacher, and he was very much loved as a teacher. So I was arguing that, you know, he was very much in the landscape, but it was a landscape that was also infused with a longing of home as well. So it was this kind of ambiguous relationship to the British landscape, to the idea of where is home, because his home was in Stafford, but of course it was also Pakistan, where he wasn't. I think I've probably used up my time, actually, so how am I doing for time? Okay. So I can talk a bit more later. I was going to talk a little bit about some of the ways in which he was using kind of modernist ideas of landscape in relation to, if you think about figuration as being the vertical line and landscape as being a horizontal line. And one of the things about modernism, when in 1959, when Barnett Newman first exhibited in London, he caused an absolute sensation amongst young people. And part of it was to do with the way that they felt that he'd really reduced the language of art down to its absolute essential things, if you like. Sorry, the word escapes me. And that was very exciting to them. So in hard edge abstraction, which was also a kind of trying to gain supremacy, if you like, in this kind of pool of people trying to create a narrative about art in the kind of 50s and early 60s, I think you can see that some of his language has come from that idea of hard edge abstraction. But yet he was also very interested in metaphor and poetry, and I think you can probably see that in the work as well. But if you think about the horizontal line being about the landscape, the horizon, I think he's invoking that in his work. And he's also, if you can see that the size of the shapes get smaller and smaller, that's about denoting distance as well. So there is this sense of creating a landscape with the tools of abstraction. So I'll stop there, shall I? And I will introduce Hammad, who I've already introduced. He's going to speak for a similar amount of time as well. So would you like to come up, Hammad?
And thank you, Aphra and Ruth and Carol and everyone here at the Wolverhampton Art Gallery, and all of you for coming along, joining us this Saturday afternoon. Yep, that's me. We're moving swiftly on. I think what I wanted to do over the next 10-15 minutes is share with you a little bit of my work as a curator. Having encountered Shemza's work for the first time, and I remember it vividly, in Karachi, next to a petrol pump on the first floor of a framer's shop. This was a sort of an impromptu exhibition, and I saw two works of the Roots series. I had never seen anything like that before. They were very modest. They looked like they were on scraps of textile. And they kind of sort of have stayed and haunted me since that time. And in some ways, perhaps of the last 25 years, I've been trying to not exorcise those ghosts, but to learn how to live with them. And my means of doing that has been through the exhibition as an exploration of practice. And I'll start and I'll sort of share a few projects with you that started in 2009, and the last of the exhibitions that I'll share were in 2022. And I think it also, that journey will perhaps also shed light into the difficulty sometimes the art world puts, the obstacles that are placed in terms of developing narratives that move beyond geography, move beyond biography. And my personal journey with the work of Shemza started at Green Cardamom. And by way of the briefest of introductions, Green Cardamom was this hybrid art space that my partner Anita Daoud and I started in the mid-2000s. It was a reaction to what we saw as a very, dare we say it, parochial kind of North Atlantic-centric art world in London. And, you'd see an artist from Louisiana, from Hanover, and, London, and you'd call that an international show. No, it wasn't. At best, it was a little regional show, hugging the North Atlantic. And we found that really strange, given where we were, London and all the sort of imperial histories and the movement of people that have been through that space. And in some way, the work of Shemza was a lens through which to try and work at this issue. And after various conversations with various curators and various institutions that I will not name, it sort of boiled down to saying, okay, we're going to have to do this ourselves. So what we came up with was this idea of Shemza in 4 takes. And that was that we'd had these conversations. We knew there was this wonderful body of work with the family. Says, can we develop different lenses of looking at that same body of work? And one of the first people had that conversation with was Rachel. I'd come across her work. She was developing an exhibition and written on the work of Chandra, Avinash Chandra, another artist, but from India, who you may have noticed the name in some of the exhibitions that Rachel put up, who was of that same generation, who had come to London in search of a sort of an international modernism, and had sort of eventually sort of moved to New York because the 60s didn't swing for them, and then sort of have come back. Alongside Rachel was the art historian and artist Iftikhar Dadi, and you'll see some of the work that Rachel was describing or was sharing with you to talk about Shemza's engagement with the landscape being used by Iftikhar Dadi here to talk about Shemza's engagement with calligraphy. And that was very much the kind of point, is that, the artwork, one, it's the start of a conversation, it's not the end of it. And two, the artwork, once it goes out into the world, it no longer belongs to the artist. The artist, I would argue, is just one of the voices that has something to say about the artwork. And that's when the work of art really takes on. So the plan was that we would do 4 of these shows. In the end, for sort of biographical reasons of my own, we ended up doing 2 of them. But what was crucial with these shows was, alongside the works themselves, there were really wonderful texts by Iftikhar and by Rachel that built conceptual bridges that allowed people access into works that they felt uncomfortable trying to grapple with, because they didn't know what registers, what art historical references, what do they see when they see the work. And one of the things that my personal sort of one of many learnings from running Green Cardamom was that for most people, they actually can't see until they read or they hear. There are very few people who actually trust their eyes. And then it was this question of, okay, well, rather than just pillory them or point fingers, how do we build these bridges that will allow people to see? And that's what these exhibitions, I think, did in some way do. And then for my own work as a curator in sort of public institutions with very different shows, what I had the privilege of then doing was to actually thinking alongside the work in very different contextual settings. This exhibition, called Beyond the Page, was at the USC Pacific Asia Museum in Pasadena. And it was looking at the South Asian manuscript of miniature painting as a lens to look at modernist and contemporary practice. And one of the practitioners there that we looked at was Shemza. I mean, if I go back, if you look at the top painting there, this was done when Shemza was a student in Lahore at the NCA. So he was patently looking at Mughal and pre-Mughal manuscript painting as part of his art training and copying this. And with this work, I was sort of following and tracing that, that training that obviously remained with him. So the grids that you see here, with the horizontal and vertical lines that have been cut into wood, this is an exercise which is kind of 101 for the first year in miniature painting, where for months on end you would sharpen your pencil and you would just draw parallel lines vertically and horizontally until you've sort of proven to your teacher that, yep, you can do parallel lines. And they're so thin that you can't find the distance between them. And only then are you allowed to do to the next step. So I think using that as literally the ground in which Shemza's roots would grow, and this is work in his in the 1980s. So part of the series, which very much marks the sort of the final chapter of his artistic oeuvre, and sort of he showed this in the US. A sister work to The Sun and the Sea is actually shown here at the Wolverhampton Gallery, and these are the sort of the ends of chairs that have been cut out to form sort of the sun and the sea. And you see this is a grab from a catalogue of a show called Drawn from Life, which I curated with Helen Watson at Abbott Hall up in Kendal. So we're in the Lake District here. So this is we're in the same sort of set of lakes where Kurt Schwitters spent the last part of his life, where lots of artists have spent time painting and working with nature. And this was, again, this engagement with landscape in a very different modernist idiom, very playful, but that completely holds its own against, some of the great names of British modernism, like Lowry, for instance. Jumping back a few years, I mean, that was 2011. We're now in 2017. And this is an exhibition that was not my curation, but by Amrita Javeri, who one of the co-founders of Javeri Contemporary. She had put together an exhibition that looked at the legacy of Gallery 1 and framed that within the rubric of South Asian modernists. And you'd recognize the Shemza paintings, one of which that Rachel had shown earlier, right in the middle, flanked by sort of some of the great names of South Asian modernist painting, M.F. Hussain on one side and Sousa on the other. Now, if you sort of cover the labels and ignore the geographical framing, the question that may appear, or certainly appeared to me, was, well, what unites these works? To me, pretty much nothing. And while these were being shown on the first floor, just below, literally below the Shemza paintings, and I don't know if you can see it, were these textiles by Barbara Brown, a sort of pioneering designer who worked for Heels, among others. Immediately after seeing this show, I went straight back, Googled Barbara Brown, found a textile on eBay for 100 quid, and that now hangs, just above my desk. And I couldn't get over the fact that Shemza, if this was a party, those paintings were in the corner, quietly, talking to their own drink, really wanting to talk here, but that avenue was blocked. Well, as luck would have it, there was an opportunity to make that conversation happen. And in a project called Speech Acts that I sort of curated with Kate Jessen at Manchester Art Gallery, we sort of took on the challenge that Rashida Araeen had laid out. Rashida Araeen is the artist and curator who curated a seminal exhibition called The Other Story. In 1989, the subtitle for that exhibition was Afro-Asian Artists in Post-War Britain. And it was meant as a kind of polemical corrective to the stories of modern art that circulate in Britain. And Shemza's work was on the cover. And that was an exhibition that actually toured both to Manchester Art Gallery and to Wolverhampton, to this art gallery. So there's this sort of this conversation over space and time that was going on. And the artist Sonia Boyce, who was leading a project called Black Artists and Modernism, invited me to curate an exhibition in dialogue with that project, which was looking at the legacy of artists of Asian and African heritage in the stories of modernism that circulate in Britain. One of my stipulations was that I was not going to repeat the other story, and we were not going to be kind of sort of developing frameworks based on geography or epidermal hues, but actually sort of place wider questions at the fore. And the question that I was really interested in was, what makes a work of art a highlight? So we looked at 4 different collections in Manchester and Wolverhampton and Bradford. And all of these collections had 100 years of Manchester Art Gallery, 125 years of the Whitworth, or 100 years of Cartwright Hall. And you mark those occasions with these beautiful coffee table books. So, what determines what goes in these books? What's a collection highlight? And then what winds up in storage and gets framed usually in those lenses of geography and biography. Who makes those decisions, and do they ever change? And can we invite people to make those changes? So Speech Acts was an attempt to make those different types of works, the highlights to those in storage, talk to each other. And a couple of those conversations that I'll point out to is the one between the works of Bridget Riley, Shemza. You'd recognize the sort of iconic work that's hanging in the exhibition here at Wolverhampton. And the other one you will see is between Barbara Brown's textile and that same painting again, which is called, irony of ironies, Conversation. Last couple of shows, and then we'll move on. And now we're coming to 2022. I was part of the curatorial team led by Ivana Blaswick at the Whitechapel Art Gallery for the show A Century of the Artist Studio, which was kind of Ivana's swan song at the Whitechapel. And this was really an ambitious attempt to survey this vast idea of an artist studio across 100 years, across the world. And one of the 80-odd artists who were featured was Shemza. You will see the same painting again, and I don't let go of things. I often say I only ever start projects, and you continue with that engagement. But I also want to come back to, actually, you will see the same sketchbook here at Wolverhampton as well. And I want to come back to that idea of Shemza teaching, because then in this show is arguing that this was Shemza's studio. And one of his students is a man called Nigel Prince, who now directs Artis Mundi in Wales. And he sort of shared with me his experience of where Shemza would give, would set the assignments, would go back to his desk, and would work on these sketchbooks. And what's really wonderful about them is, well, not only is it because he's just ridiculously neat, is that you'd have these different variations of a work, and there'll be a tick next to one of them. And that would make its way into a painting. So this is almost a pre-digital studio. He's really working out ideas as on the side of his teaching duties, while his students are working out themselves. And the last show that I wanted to end on was Postwar Modern. This was where I was an advisor to the curatorial team led by Jane Allison, and this was her last show as head of visual arts at the Barbican, so I don't know what that says. But the work that you're seeing here in conversation, you'll see the sculptures of Kim Lim, the paintings of Shemza. In fact, 2 of those 3 paintings are here in Wolverhampton. and Patrick Heron is the sort of the far painting. If you could see the rest of the room, you will see Frank Bowling and Gillian Ayres. So you're seeing artists in conversation that have seldom hitherto been put in conversation with each other. And I wanted to sort of leave with the cover of the catalogue in which I wrote a text that talked about the vectors of the new and looked at the work in sort of parallel trajectories of Kim Lim, who was born in Singapore, Shemza, who was born in India, who both arrive at the Slade in the 50s, make their careers here, and kind of disappear from British art history. And I think we are now in a process of recovery. And what I wanted to sort of add to this was that I think what's at stake is not simply the reputation of one or two artists or the value of one or two estates, but actually what it does is the work of Kim Lim or of Shemza helps us ask wider and bigger questions of, what does sculpture mean? What does abstraction mean? And what are the different genealogies that these things may come from? And I think that's where projects like what Aphra has done with Wolverhampton in allowing different people an entry into the visual language and genealogies of practice of artists like Shemza are I think, more power to your elbow. Thank you.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm going the wrong way. Okay, so I'm not Haroon Hayward, obviously, but Haroon unfortunately couldn't make it today, so I'm just going to say a few words about his practice. I've reduced his many, many slides to 5 or 6. And also just to say, we've been with Haroon earlier on in the week for his exhibition that has just opened at Hales Gallery in London. And it was absolutely fantastic, the show. So I just want to draw on some of the ideas that Haroon has within his work. And talk about the connections between Haroon, what Haroon's doing, and also what Hammad has been doing in his work and Rachel's been doing in her work, thinking about the British landscape, thinking about cultural heritage, and also techno and rave culture, just bringing that in there, which is some of Haroon's inspiration. So Haroon is a painter. He's a British artist with South Asian heritage. And he creates these really stunning paintings. And the way in which they're formed, that I've been finding out this year, or this week in fact, is that the tops of the paintings, so the sort of square area at the top, this is, Haroon will listen to music, and he has synesthesia, so when he listens to music, he can see these shapes and colours appearing in his head. And he thought that everybody else did that happen to everybody else, but no, it is unique to synesthesiacs. So the paintings that he creates, they're taken three different parts. So the top is the music inspiration and how he sees that in visual language. Underneath, you have these they're almost like brackets or parentheses, and those parts of the paintings are directly in response to British landscape painters. I don't 100% know which landscape painter this artwork is, but in the show that we have at Hales, it's all about Paul Nash and Graham Sutherland works. So he's kind of taking these parts of the paintings and reimagining them in his own work. And at the very bottom right, you get this, it's a take on his mother's textile collection from South Asia. So you have this real, and he told me about how he makes, when you see them they look like often textiles. This is a close-up of that landscape take. Here's a better image where you can see that it really looks more like a textile. And I thought that he had actually taken textile from his mother's collection and pasted it onto the painting. But he actually told me he uses oil paint sticks, and he scrapes at the oil paint sticks and creates all this little kind of shreds, and then uses that on the painted surface to create this textile effect. And you really don't get a sense of the quality of that in the image at all, but they're absolutely stunning works. So you have the three different elements to all his works, and a lot of his paintings are made up like this. This work, you can see, really is referencing these Shemza works that Hammad talked about earlier. So this was the work, the conversation that was in the Speech Act show. And this piece here is now placed with Tate. So if you go to Tate Modern, I think it's hanging in their permanent collection there. And you can really see the way Haroon sees music or sees abstraction as really having that conversation to Shemza there. And Haroon told me that his mum introduced him to Shemza. She had seen his work at Birmingham Art Gallery. And that was his kind of introduction in, and he's now got very interested into that. These are some of his so he also does these wonderful watercolors, and these watercolors are based on Graham Sutherland paintings, and he was actually at a residency where he would take this painting and he would create a watercolor over the course of a day in the changing light. So this is one of about 20 watercolors that you get that are all the same kind of thing, but just in different light qualities. So they're quite stunning altogether. This is a shot from Hale's gallery, so you can see there. So if you are in London, it would be great to go and check it out. It's really fantastic work. So I think I will leave Haroon there because obviously I can't expand too much on his work. But yeah, we just really wanted to bring Haroon in as that somebody who is British but who has that cultural heritage in their own identity, and who's also drawing on these ideas of British landscape and British painting and abstraction and figuration. So he's kind of fusing all of these thoughts together in his practice. And so that's why we wanted Rachel and Hammad and Haroon to really talk about that together. And there'll be much more time to explore that in the questions at the end. So I can now introduce myself. Obviously, you all know that I'm Aphra Shemza. I'm a multimedia artist, and I'm also manager of the estate of Anwar Jalal Shemza, my grandfather. So we have the exhibition here, and in my own practice as an artist, so I did my BA in London, and I've been graduated for about 12 years now. So since leaving university, I've been on this artistic journey of my own. And I create, traditionally speaking, I'm a sculptor. I combine wood, metal, and plastic with interactive and bespoke electronic circuits. And part of my work, I'm really interested in modernism. I'm really inspired by my grandfather's work, and I'm really interested in this idea that abstraction was a universal language for the masses. But in my work, I'm trying to think about how, was it really then? Because actually at the time, I think it was actually quite exclusive, perhaps. People didn't quite understand what it was all about. So what I'm trying to do with my work is to use technology and interactive devices to allow members of the public access points to get involved and excited in the work. So a lot of my pieces are interactive. They have sensors in them. You'll see in the gallery, they respond to you if you go up to them. And yeah, trying to make art and art making accessible to everybody through not just my art practice, but also through educational projects too. So as I mentioned, I'm managing the estate of Anwar Jalal Shemza, and that really just means that my family and I, we own many of Shemza's works, artworks. So we have paintings, prints, sculpture, drawings, sketchbooks, and a whole archive of press cuttings, those exhibition leaflets, writing by my grandfather to his friends, letters. And it's a really amazing, what a privilege to have that, you know, to be surrounded with that and having grown up with that in my family home. So Rachel did a very good job of introducing Shemza's practice and what he was doing, his biography. He really fused the East and the West together, you know, thinking about his cultural heritage and bringing in the ideas that and experiences that he had in the UK and learning about Western modernism. Some of these works have been shown before, but you can really see he worked in different series, and each of the series has a different kind of aesthetic quality and a different kind of theme to it. So we have the City Walls series, the Magic Carpet series, where he's using textile in his work, and the Meme series, where he's drawing on calligraphy too, and the letter M in Arabic is in Urdu is a backwards P shape. So he's using that and to create these different forms. And I mentioned we have the archive. So as part of my work with the estate, alongside my practice, I'm also packing and shipping artworks for exhibitions. We're placing work in public collections and publishing books and doing events and talks like this to share Shemza's work with as many people as possible. And the archive, my mum and I are cataloguing at the moment, which is quite a job. So we're scanning in all the documents, we are cataloguing them, and with an aim to make some of these materials available to people to use in their essays or things like that. And so whilst that was happening, then the pandemic hit, and I'd been sort of exhibiting my artwork and, you know, having this normal kind of sense of what was going on with my practice. And then I needed to quickly reinvent my art practice and decide what I was going to now do in the pandemic. And one of the conversations I'd been having was with Hammad, and also, you know, being embedded within this world, having an understanding that times are changing, that Anwar's work had been excluded for many years, and that within the last 10 years, which is basically the time that I've been managing the estate, people are excited and interested in his work, and that is to do with Hammad's incredible efforts with Green Cardamom and these curations and these shows that have been happening. So kind of understanding that. And also, Hammad and I had a conversation where we were talking about how academics and curators know about Shemza's work, and times are changing, but the public doesn't know about his work yet. So he's not in the school curriculum, and young people haven't heard of him. And how do we sort of get that message out there? How do we invite the public to also learn about his work? And I wanted to take elements from my own practice, so making interactive sculpture, working with participatory devices and digital work, and create a project that was based on Anwar's work, but allowed the public to sort of get involved and consider themselves in relationship to Anwar's practice. And the pandemic had hit, so we were thinking about creating an entirely digital project, but I didn't have any knowledge of how to make computer art, so I collaborated with the wonderful artist Stuart Batchelor, who's a computer artist. And Stuart he draws with traditional media, and then he scans that into a computer and uses a bespoke software to manipulate his paintings, and then produces these incredible artworks. So Stuart had the knowledge. So together we set out to create a digital painting app, and that is how the Shemza Digital Project was launched in the pandemic as a digital painting app that was based on Anwar's practice. And the idea was that people all at home who were self-isolating could become artists themselves, create their own artworks, and submit them to our archive. So we've talked about this work has come up a lot. This is really important work. Inscribed in Urdu across the front, in the middle section of that work, it says, "One circle, one square, one problem, one lifetime is not enough to solve it." And for me, I love this idea that I could continue that exploration in my lifetime, and that I could empower and invite others to also continue this exploration. And this is not just a formal exploration of a square and a circle. you know, it's also a kind of metaphysical exploration of geometry and what that means in the world. So if we think about abstraction and geometry, is the reduction of form. And through the reduction of form, we're able to talk about things that are much bigger than ourselves. We can talk about our connections to nature, we can talk about our connections to one another and our connection to the universe. We can see mathematical patterns, we can see the Fibonacci shell and the spirals and in branches and leaves in trees, and geometry really allows us to talk about the universe and everything. So Shemza.digital, we're transforming Anwar's work for a contemporary audience. And in the digital painting app, we did that by looking at Anwar's work and then encoding these digital paints. So on the left, you can see one of Anwar's paintings, and on the right, you can see our squircle paint, which is our square and circle. And it's become really the overall mascot for the project. We had these 3 different paints. So we had our weave paint, we had the wall by Shemza, which is the front cover of the Other Story catalogue that we've spoken about already this evening. And a lot of Anwar's family, they were carpet makers in Pakistan. So Anwar uses this textile again and again in his work and in his Magic Carpet series as well. And here we've created our digital version, the weave paint, that users can explore in the app. We've also spoken a bit about this series, so the table and chair legs that were cut off to form these sort of topographical compositions. There's a work in the show here. And we created our Mosaic Paint, where you can click and drag your finger across the screen and a trail of circles or squares will follow your finger, so you can create your own composition. And those paints can be used on their own, or they can be used all together to form just your own unique compositions. And I hope that many of you have had a go and tried it out. We've had over 5,000, nearly 6,000 paintings, digital paintings, submitted to our archive from members of the public. I think we've had at least half of that was here at this show in the last couple of months, and then the rest was the last couple of years. And we began with this digital painting app. It was the pandemic. We asked people to submit their paintings to our archive, which is held online. And then the aim was that we were always going to turn the paintings back physical again into an installation when we could, post-COVID. And I just love this idea of involving the public in the creation of that installation. So we'd gone one step with the creation of the digital painting app and asked the public to make their own paintings, but I wanted to continue that co-creation spirit. So I held 6 workshops with different communities across the country. I worked with young people in the Grenfell community in London. I worked with artists from LGBTQ group in Sheffield, artists in London, young people in Margate. So there was a real range of communities and different backgrounds and ideas that I was working with there. We built an installation version of the digital painting app that we used in the co-creation workshops. So now the public were able to draw and paint on the ceiling, wall and floors. They were also able to create these kind of foreground elements that I was trying to ask them to think about creating light sculptures. And they could place a figure into the application as well, and so that their installation would either be really, really big or really small, depending on the scale of the figure. So it was a nice way to sort of start thinking about that. And so what you see here is the culmination of those workshops. So I had about 40 different installation images that the public had created. I then had time alone in my studio to look at what was there and to think about how I could translate these ideas into physical reality. So not only are these works based on Anwar's work, and clearly you can see in the sculptures here, they're based on this Islamic architecture. So Anwar has taken city walls into his practice from architecture and made them 3D to 2D, and then I've taken his 2D and made it 3D again via this communication with the public. But all of these pieces, we've got these archways, there's a column motif, and then at the back you've got this UV piece that's based on the Jali screen which you see in Islamic architecture. So these are some of the sculptures, and the sculptures have these interactive ultrasonic sensors inside them. So there's a small computer inside the sculpture, and there's a little sensor, and it works by how bats and whales, they echolocate themselves. They send out a little sound wave, a little ping, and they wait for it to bounce off an object, and their brains can compute when it gets bounced back, how long it took for that thing to get bounced back, and they know so that they don't bump into anything. And that's what my sculptures are doing. So they're measuring, they're sending out a little sound pulse, and if there's someone there, it feeds back to the computer, and the computer displays that in LED. And this is something I've been using in my work for the last 10 years. And so it was really nice to bring back those interactive devices again. And we also have the ability, there's two projection works. We've got one which is it's the painting app, so you can create your own painting with the original app, and then you submit it to the archive, and you can see your artwork appear on the gallery wall. So the public's artworks are put in equal place with mine and with everybody else's work in the gallery wall. So when we've been doing workshops with children and young people, their work is on the gallery wall, which is quite an interesting way of working with the public. The other piece that we developed for this show was a collaborative digital painting app. So on the right-hand side, more than one person can paint at once on the canvas that's shown in real time on the wall. So you can scan a QR code with your phone, and there can be up to 10 people collaboratively drawing at once on the wall. And then every so often that will screenshot. You can vote to save your work, and every so often that will screenshot, and you'll watch it on the third wall in that triangle. And of course we have where it all came from and all the inspiration. So everything is based on Anwar's practice, on his work, on the historical significance and understanding of his work within British art history. And we've got this nice sort of curatorial device to link the show together with this floor vinyl that runs through the exhibition. It takes us through the archway, through to the projection, and then up and into Anwar's work there, the City Walls series. So it's through, I hope, through this sort of digital art and art making practice that the public are able to consider themselves in relationship to some of these ideas, in relationship to identity, thinking about, championing diversity and other stories and why that's important, especially now. And I think that's really important because we've got, with Brexit happening and the rise, it's sort of created this rise in nationalism. We've got economic austerity happening at the moment. And that's when communities and peoples tend to split away from each other, and the other becomes it's kind of this idea of an other becomes quite important. And so I really wanted to bring people together with the art practice and the project and try and think about those ideas through the artistic lens, I guess you could say. So thank you. That's me.
So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to ask, this is very loud actually, isn't it? I'm going to ask a couple of questions and then I'll open it up to the floor because I'm sure there's lots of questions and conversations that we can have. Hammad, I'm just going to ask you, I have to ask this question first. So your Green Cardamom show, that was going to be 4 takes. What were the other 2 takes going to be?
The other 2 takes were going to be, one was by the art historian Amna Malik, who at that time was at UCL. And I think it was, she was still developing ideas, but it was going to be with geometry. That's something.
Oh, okay.
And the 4th take was going to be by another art historian, Savita Apte, who had worked a lot on Sousa and sort of Indian modernists in Britain. So it was looking at the reception of a lot of these artists from South Asia in Britain in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, because I think it'd be really interesting to have an exhibition of the 4 takes in a way.
Well, in a way, I mean, you would have seen the small. It was a very modest space. You know, you could fit about 4 green cardamoms in this room, and you know, it was always sort of believed that you know you can't keep. You know, the idea should not be restricted by the size of space. There's a Gujarati saying that if you're going to eat an elephant, so apologies to the vegetarians among you, but if you're going to eat an elephant, do it in small bites. So that was the conception behind you know, 4 takes, because if we couldn't get you know, the big institutions to do a retrospective, that's fine. We would do it in these small takes, and then they would sort of accumulate and become that larger retrospective. And in some ways, that the monograph for Shemza Writing House and that produced, I think, very much came out of that impetus.
Yes, and it does that to some extent. And one of the things you talked about was something that, you know, I try and do my own work, which is thinking about when you're working with artists who don't have as much visibility as they might have. Part of the project is to make them more visible. But as you alluded at the end of your talk, the other probably more important job, if you like, is to reconceptualize what art is. And I just wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit more about how Shemza's been able to, or the work that you've done, the wider work that you've done, has been able to reconceptualize what, you know, British art or what art might be in Britain today. Or is that too big a question? Sorry.
Big question. It's a big question, but taking that sort of small bites example, maybe I'll share 2 perspectives. One of them is the ongoing project, which you also touched on, that I co-lead at the Paul Mellon Center. So the Paul Mellon Center is part of Yale University, and it's a research center for histories of British art and architecture. And the project that I co-lead there is called London, Asia. And that comma is kind of important because what it suggests is that, you know, this is London as a site within Asia's art histories, but then it also kind of flips it around to say as if we account for people like Shemza or Kim Lim, whose work we showed, or David Badaya or Rashid Arain, what does that do to histories of abstraction in Britain or sculpture in Britain? You know, what sort of genealogies does that cover? And in some ways, it's not simply about expanding. That seems to suggest that there's something there, and what you have to do is kind of just add on. It's actually about sort of puncturing and then seeing through other possibilities. And I think this is an ongoing project, and it's not a project that any one person or institution can do on their own. And that's why I think I'm sort of particularly attracted to projects like the London Asia project, or even when we did the British Art Show here. I mean, the first time I personally visited Wolverhampton was on a recce trip for when Irene and I were appointed curators for the British Art Show. And we first came into the galleries, and we were kind of stunned by just looking at the collections. You know, the collections of artists from Northern Ireland, you know, the biggest outside Northern Ireland, or pop art, which kind of sounds fluffy, but actually pop art is the language of protest. You know, that's where placards came from. You know, that's what Guernica is. It's political art. It's protest pop art. And then, you know, the Black Art Group. And it felt so kind of, not just heavy, but also felt pertinent to the contemporary artists that we were showing. So we ended up doing, so like where you have the historic work of Shemza, working with the gallery and colleagues from the University of Birmingham, we selected like a show within a show, so that the contemporary artists were very much in conversation with works that were in Wolverhampton's collection. Because we felt that was really important, because it was about drawing out these historic hinges, which sometimes we lose sight of, because the art world is so invested in the new. And I think part of looking at the new is to refresh and remind ourselves of these historic hinges. And I think it's out of that we can sort of look to the future.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you. And I mean, I share that aim, if you like, of wanting to show art as being about conversations with a range of people, not just being these kind of silos. That art history often puts things in boxes, but to open up those boxes and see what kind of runs between them is really important. And in fact, that's what you do as well, Aphra, isn't it? You're opening up a conversation with the future, if you like, in terms of what Shemza's work can do for the future. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about what it is you think your grandfather's work does for contemporary young people who engage with those works that you talked about so eloquently. Sorry, is that another bit? I'll tell you what, while you think about that, I'll ask you something that's kind of more fun and probably more interesting anyway, is so, obviously you're working with your grandfather's work and you're working with his archive, which must be amazing. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the journey from being a kind of young woman in this household of descendants of this interesting artist, and of course Mary, we mustn't forget, who's also an artist in her own right, and your journey to becoming an artist in your own right, and then looking after the archive of your grandfather. I just wondered if there's, it'd be really nice to hear some insights about that journey for you.
So the family journey. So I guess I grew up surrounded with Anwar's work. So in our family home, it's hanging on the walls, and in Grandma's home as well, we have it surrounding us. But so at first, you don't know what it is really, because they're just things in your house. But obviously, as you grow up, you start to get a bit of a better sense of, these are really important paintings, And I was learning a lot about my heritage as I was growing up, and starting to get really excited about creating my own artworks. And I remember Anwar unfortunately died 3 years before I was born, so I didn't get to meet him. But my grandma Mary is an artist still, is a painter. She's still painting, and my family, my mum and dad, it was very supportive. You could be an artist. There was no, you have to be an accountant or whatever. You were allowed. And Grandma we'd always be in her studio with all the paints, and there was Anwar's paints there as well, and things that he had been using in his work. And at GCSEs, I was already recreating some works from the Chessmen series as a chess board. I actually made cardboard chess pieces, when I was 16 years old. But then I really went away from just making little versions of Anwar's work to investigate kind of more Western ideas of abstraction, thinking about the Bauhaus and kinetic art. So I began making kinetic art. I went really into the realms of the digital and interactive, always with geometry, but only really recently I've come back to, again, being inspired by Anwar's work, and that's come with this rediscovery of the archive and of a lot of my own heritage, and understanding my own cultural heritage and where I'm placed as a third generation, with South Asian heritage. So it's very interesting, this journey. Hope that gives a bit of a sense.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you. I just wondered if there are any questions or observations or comments from the audience at all.
I was just going to ask something else about Anwar's interest in landscape. Obviously, you lived in Stafford, and as somebody who loves the Staffordshire landscape herself, I'm often out walking in it. I'm interested whether he drew inspiration from the actual landscape just around his own home area.
So he definitely was out and about in the landscape, but him and my grandma had this beautiful garden, and in the garden they had apple tree, and there's a whole series that he created called Apple Tree, and so that's really based based on what he could see around him, and he loved gardening as well. So the natural forms and plant forms that you find, they are happening when he's moving through his world and his life. So yes, I guess. I don't know too much about landscape. I don't know if Mum has any anecdotes from being in the landscape or going for walks and things like that, bringing you in.
I was thinking that was a question for Rachel, really, with the landscape take that we did there. So we'll bounce at you. It's the real anecdote, I suppose, that I have of my father in the garden is linked to how his appearance, how he presented himself, his artwork, his practice in general is also meticulous and worked over and over. So the edges of the lawn had to be absolutely perfect. And they were trimmed almost with nail scissors. and it's his whole practice, he was very intense and very kind of obsessive about things, and that translates in that way, I think.
I'll answer that in a minute, but a woman in the green top has a question.
In the pandemic, I listened to the radio a lot, and there was art galleries in America who were picking up. There's people from lots of different countries in a city, different tropical islands, and you could have changing art exhibitions of these people from different countries to share together in a city. And I think this is a good start. You know, he's lived some time in Wolverhampton and Stafford and Pakistan. It's really nice to hear this, but there's people of 60 different languages in this city, and a lot of them are refugees as well, but it'd be nice to see their heritage here in this place, and this could be quite a hot pot of cultural sharing and intertrading and the future, because there's nothing worse than being cut off from your past and your country, especially there's lots of people here who aren't here out of choice, they're running away from wars. It'll be nice to keep some sort of link like that. So this is very exciting and gives great hope for the future. Looking forward to seeing it develop. There's a big Pakistani community in Wolverhampton as well.
Yeah, I was going to respond to that by saying yes. I mean, this does reflect some of the communities in the area in any case. And I think the Wolverhampton Art Gallery, as Hammad just identified, has actually always been very receptive to that. And certainly they were the first people to embrace the Black Art Group in the 1980s, when they were just young art students trying to find somewhere to show, and also saying, why aren't there more black faces in art galleries? Where are all the artists? Where are all our antecedents? So I think this art gallery has got a really good history of listening, and certainly there are curators here from this gallery. I'm sure they've heard what you said as well. So there's a gentleman over here who wants to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. My name is Sam. I'm working with a project called Sense of Place, and been working with refugee group here since December. So I've been reading with me, and we look at different collections and trying to draw out their past cultures and whatever in the present moment, looking through the lenses of these exhibitions. The first one we went to was Aphra. They were fascinated by the links with the past and the digital stuff. I mean, really. So things started to happen.
I'll just add to that, if it's okay. I'm only from the gallery team here, but just the mention of Black Art Group, Rachel, our next exhibition, taking over the spaces shemza.digital focuses on the Black Art Group and their legacy and their links to Wolverhampton and also Citizen UK, which is in another of our contemporary spaces in May, is working with the Sea community here, looking at legacies and kind of the role of the gallery as a civic space. It's a project with the National Portrait Gallery, so keep coming back, there's lots more coming up.
Thank you.
Wider Punjabi community, it's even Punjabi community. Yeah. So we're doing lots of work in those areas.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. My comment wasn't meant to put anybody on the spot at all. I was just...
It's good to talk about what we're doing. We're visiting and keep nothing much shit.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a very nice gallery space there with the museum artifacts of the collection, haven't we, with the relabelling and the rethinking of holding those works.
Sharing those, yes. Yeah, it's small, but it's sort of, it's a small step in that direction. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think going back to this idea of the landscape, and you want to say something, don't you? I'll just in a sec. I think that that idea of landscape is something that speaks to a lot of people, whatever your, original geographical location, if you like, of birth was, and certainly some of the languages that Shemza has, which is about longing for landscape. It's about claustrophobia. It's about freedom through the claustrophobia. There's all sorts of kind of metaphors within the work that I think can speak to a wider experience than just his own particular. And I think that is also partly the power of abstraction, as well, as Aphra said earlier, that there are specificities, but they are not particular, if you know what I mean. So there's something that people can engage with. Aphra, you wanted to say something a bit earlier? No?
We've kind of moved on from it. It's fine.
Are there any more questions from the audience or comments?
Oh, Islamic architecture is my favourite architecture.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of that in Shemza as well.
There's a lot of that in Shemza, and I think one of the quotes, and I'll paraphrase because I don't remember the exact words, it was that that he said it's architecture and text that is of interest to him.
It's like Zahir Hadid. I met her.
Yeah.
She died in, was it 2016?
Yes, a few years back. Yeah.
I know she was from the Middle East, but what?
Iraq.
Iraq.
Yeah. It's of Iraqi heritage.
I'm just going to ask about the first time I saw very much of Anwar's work was at the Tate exhibition in 2015 or 2016, around then.
Yeah, it was 2015 to 16, yeah.
It's quite an important exhibition, but I don't think it was covered in this presentation. I just wondered if there was a little bit more you could say about that and how it had come about.
Is that for Hammad?
I mean, it definitely started with Hammad.
Well, it was a spotlight. I mean, it's what they call a spotlight display. So I think there are all these gradations of, what is an exhibition or not. So I think within Tate parlance, it was a display. It was centered around works that they had acquired. And in fact, the first work they acquired was from, they acquired works from each of those two takes. And I think that's when you build those bridges and people read those texts and they kind of figure out, okay, how it fits. And then they start interacting and developing. And it's good to hear that they've been acquiring since. And I think, because it's such an important body of work. And I think it's a reflection of that meticulousness that Tasveer you were pointing out. That, if he had made all the paintings that he had sketched, there'd be hundreds and hundreds of works. But they're not, because he was very particular. And he didn't live for a very long time. It was, he died in his 50s. So it's a very short life. And I think I'm so glad to hear that the Tate has been adding on. And I think, and I'm also sort of making slight meal out of this, in that, because I don't sort of see that as an exhibition. I see that as a display. And I think the exhibition, a proper retrospective of all of those things coming together and all the work that's gone on, I think that is in the future.
I think you're absolutely right to make that distinction, because, of course, it is about the kind of hierarchies of offer that the take give, and who is deemed kind of important enough to have a full retrospective and who doesn't. And it was almost like that spotlight was a kind of testing the water, let's see if, he's important enough. But, of course, there was a conference around the same time around the Black Art Modernism. There was a research project that was led by Sonia Boyce, David DeBosa and Susan Puissant-Locke, and they had a big conference around that while the spotlight was on, and there was a workshop that I took part in, or I led, I guess, where we talked about his work. So I think it did establish an interest. One of the things I was going to ask you, actually, Hammad, was because obviously you've been very important in the development of an interest in Shemza and his importance. And I was wondering, when did you know that it was going to kind of take off a bit? Or was there a moment when you thought, okay, that's a signal that more was going to happen?
It's always difficult looking at these things in hindsight. So when you started, and there was a kind of, I have a misspent youth in financial and professional services, so entered the art world. It was a very lateral entry, and at that point it felt like, okay, the gallery would be a good way of doing it, but there was a hybrid creature, and the kinds, the artists we were interested in showing were either artists who didn't think in English necessarily, and so we were either intervening and allowing people, building sort of these bridges into their practice, mostly young artists, or for a couple, Shemza and Zahur Lakhlaq was the other artist, who had fallen in between, to our eyes, in between different stools of art history. So they were not so present in, say, the South Asian art history or Pakistan's art history, and they were certainly not present in Britain. So and this was not by any means a profit-maximizing strategy, was, how do you address this? How do you fill in that gap? And then it was coming out of, okay, well, what do we need to do? How do we get people to see it? How do we intervene? Not just in kind of the sort of the visibility, but also in the discursive spaces. How do we get people to think about what this work means for things that they've already written about, or what they already think, and how they get to question that. And part of that then comes out of not any one institution, but out of the sort of the multiple things. And many of the conversations that we had started, I'd say between 2009 and 12, and only sort of came to fruition much later. I remember, I forget the exact date, but it was probably something like 2014, 15, or 16, when the Guggenheim bought a whole slew of works from the estate, and the curator at that time had sent a message to me saying, "Oh, we finally did it." And I said, "Great, it's a little bit late for Green Cardamom, but I'm so glad that it's there." So, and I think when that happened, when alongside the Tate, we were also able to place one of the works that you showed, in fact, in the landscape at the British Museum, and then two wonderful works are with the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And then you had, sort of the Guggenheim buying a whole bunch of works. And then I was in Hong Kong, and Leslie Ma, who was the curator at that time, bought a suite of Shemza works as part of her ink collection. So you suddenly have, when you have major museums buying work for very different reasons, What does Shemza have to say to histories of ink painting, or the Met in New York? So, how does this connect to histories of abstraction or lettrism? Or for Tate, it's about, British modernism. Or the British Museum, it's the connections with their historic work. I think once you have these multiple voices and multiple ideas. I think that's when it, it feels like, okay, there's a little density here. Something's happening.
Something's happening. Yeah, no, that's very useful to hear. Because I remember right at the beginning of my journey when I was looking at Avinash Chandra and Shemza, actually, for a chapter in a book that Rashid Areen commissioned me to write, which has never got published. The book, he commissioned all these essays from people a lot more illustrious than me as well, and he didn't ever publish the book, which is a real shame. But I went to the V&A to look in their print room, and I remember looking, there was a Chandra and I think a Shemza there, but they were in the Indian collection. I was like, why are they in the Indian collection? I asked the keeper of the prints, and she said, well, it's because, their careers were in India. And I was like, no, they weren't at all. So I think that when they become, this kind of geographical specificity in a way is in itself a kind of bogus conversation, But I thought the fact that they were put in this other, this India is really shows how they were completely marginalised, within the art histories of the place where they were living and working as artists. So, Aphra, I'd quite like to ask you about, obviously, at the moment, your grandfather's work is quite important in your own work, and I just wondered whether what you were working on now as an artist and where you were thinking of going forward, if there were, is Anwar going to continue to be an important part of your own practice, do you think, or is it you can't move away from that, or what's happening?
Thank you. Yeah, so definitely I've created the Shemza.digital project. So the Shemza.digital project is definitely going to continue. I'd like to, over the last few years, we've been heavily involved in educational work. So the chance to do an exhibition and create artworks is fantastic. But my main kind of aim is to try and get Shemza into every school curriculum in the country, and provide free teaching resources and workshops and these digital tools for all children to use. So I'd really like to take the Shemza.digital project in that direction. I'm also an artist, and I've really enjoyed working with the public and co-creating some of these sculptural elements, the sculptures and the digital projects. So I'd like to continue that and tour the show. And with my own project, with my own artwork, I also have a sort of sustainable and eco angle. And I've been working a lot with plastic recycling and creating artworks that are about global warming and climate change. And I've been kind of separating these things, but they're not separate, because when we talk about global issues, there is this idea of decolonization and colonialism and what's been happening in these countries. And I feel that at some point these ideas are going to come back together and form something slightly more cohesive about, the world and what's happening in it now.
And of course, global warming is affecting the global south a lot more acutely than it's affecting Europe and North America. Mudslides in California notwithstanding, it's that sounds really interesting. I wondered if there are any more. Yes.
I've been doing an art project on bread history and the birth of wheat in the Middle East and the Fertile Crescent, and I found doing that the last few years, the Fertile Crescent and the beginning of civilization in the Middle East used to be on the school curriculum here, and it got taken off. So I'm looking to get it back in, just from the feedback from the art exhibition. Some retired people said, oh, we used to do that in infant school, all the younger generations in my age group, which is 50 actually. I hadn't heard of it, I didn't know anything about the birth of wheat was in Syria and Iraq and Iran, where it's all trouble now. So I'm just thinking of how to do that.
I think what you raised is also a point. When I was in Hong Kong as the head of research programs and education, one of the things we did for the education program was to say, you know, yes, we can invite the art teachers, but the education program, actually we need to privilege people teaching English and geography and history, and thinking about art really as a window through which to see and understand the world. And I think this is a much bigger topic, but we do a really poor job of teaching history in this country. We think we're really great with history. We're not. Just looking at what my kids are being taught in school, and I think rather than sort of berating or sort of pointing fingers, I think we have an opportunity as cultural practitioners, as people with the resources that we have here, is to add to it, to say, well, actually, there is much richer ways of getting at history, and actually that's the history that sticks. And as the novelist Salman Rushdie had sort of said through one of his characters, that the problem with the English is that most of their history took place elsewhere, so they don't know it. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I think as part of being cultural practitioners, I think that's what we need to kind of collectively try and address.
Thank you, Hammad. I'm just wondering if there's anybody wants to make any last comments or interventions or... Yes?
My friend and I were both pupils of Anwar Shemza, and we feel very privileged to have been. And to teach is to touch a life, and you certainly did.
Thank you. That's very touching. Thank you. Yes?
Hi. Not quite as lovely as that, I'm afraid. that was obviously a laugh. That's kind of so, Hammad, I know you've just been talking about in terms of the institutional sort of nodes, I guess you were trying to get sort of train reaction of you trying to get it, as it were. And after you were speaking about obviously wanting it in the curriculum of every sort of school in the country, of course. But I was wondering if either of you could maybe speak to any of the potential difficulties, lack of understanding and stuff like that in terms of negotiating with the institutions or various like funders and stuff like that, and having to negotiate in terms of maybe having to bend projects to either fit funding requirements and stuff like that, and all that sort of stuff that doesn't get sort of talked about in wanting to create like these wonderful sort of exhibitions and stuff, and have there been any sort of difficulties or like frustrations with that, or has it been a case of you go to these people and they get it and stuff like that, or like the sort of process and that kind of stuff? If you feel comfortable with that. Yeah,
I was just going to say, how long have we got?
2 sentences.
Well, let me sort of answer it. I'll start, and maybe you want to add on. Shemza died in 1985. Yeah, so the first of the takes was 2009, and it's not as if there was nothing done, because the other story in which Shemza was the cover image was 1989. So it toured here in Wolverhampton in 1990. But it was, 20 years after that before the national collection, as represented by the Tate, bought their first Shemza. And I think you probably would have figured out that I'd had many conversations with many people at the Tate before that happened. And I think one sort of big point with that is that you are seeing here people who've been directly involved in sort of working on a legacy as curators, as artists, as family, as researchers and writers. And I think the bigger point is that yes, of course we think Shemza is distinctive, but there are probably hundreds and thousands of distinctive artists. So actually what we have to think about is, and I've sort of written about this as a kind of this phrase of art histories of excess. How do we create possibilities of writing histories, of having them become visible, that overwhelm these systems that we work in, you know, which is about, oh, I can only supervise 2 PhDs a year, and only one of them can be doing anything other than Turner. Or Hockney, of course. Yeah, that's it's a perpetual Hockney fest in London if you happen to live there. So it's when can we do a retrospective which is not Hockney? And so there are these kind of barriers that prevent this sort of visibility from happening. And the answers to that are not sort of individual heroic efforts, no matter how heroic and how much resources can be done, but they're systemic. Is how do we find new ways to collaborate, new ways to actually marshal these very different spheres. And I think the one really good thing about it that sort of I've certainly observed in the last 20 years or so of being in the art field is that in a multipolar field, in a multipolar world, suddenly you have greater sort of competition for ideas. So I think it's not completely coincidental that when Rashid Arain's first sort of survey exhibition happened in Sharjah, or when Li Wancha's retrospective happened in Taiwan, or when Kim Lim's retrospective is being staged in the National Gallery Singapore, there's a little sort of flurry of activities in Blighty saying, ooh, but these are all artists who were here, how can the Philippines be doing a David Madaya exhibition? Well, where is the David Madaya exhibition in an institution in the UK? There hasn't been one.
Yeah, and I mean, just to add to that, so I've mentioned before that I was also researching Avinash Chandra, and it's been quite interesting to me to watch the different strategies that have been pursued around Chandra and Shemza. Sorry. Avinash Chandra's estate was bought by a commercial gallery. And then they found that the value wasn't as high as they expected it to be because he'd had a fire sale in Miami in the 80s and, all the rest of it. And so they kind of dumped his estate, and it's now owned by the Delhi Art Gallery in India. And so he's still, he was the first Indian artist to be bought by the Tate, and, they've still got his painting. And even when he died, it wasn't shown. And in fact, it was shown in the exhibition that you curated. But his reputation is nowhere near the kind of level of the reputation of Shemza now. And I think that there is something about kind of strategizing and thinking about, what actually brings an artist into being, into visibility, and what are the things that institutions value. And I think that you've been very adept in helping institutions understand why it's important to collect Shemza's work. And that's no mean achievement, at all. And unfortunately, that wasn't able to happen for Chandra and many others, as Hammad's just said. But I think that it takes a lot of work to get someone into visibility. And that visibility is never guaranteed. 10 years from now, it could go a completely different way. And I think that's what happens with any artist, As Greenberg said to Pollock, you've had 10 good years, what are you complaining about? When he was complaining about, how bad things were for him. So I think that, I think it behoves us to remember that as well, that, the art world is a fickle animal. But that's also the importance of museums, because they hold, they hold it. They have the paper trail. Aphra, did you want to?
Yeah, so I just wanted to, I suppose I came into this 10 years ago. Hammad had already been doing incredible work, and later now we're also working with 2 commercial galleries, Hales Gallery and Javeri Contemporary. And so we're continuing, some of the strategies and ideas, like continuing to place works. And we published a monograph in 2016, which was the first real book about Shemza's work. There's some in the shop downstairs. Through these activities, we're able to sort of raise the profile. And I think my project is, I guess in a sense, I've seen and understood the difficulties that other people had been facing, and I'm coming in at a very later stage with this shemza.digital project, so I've been able to really design it to avoid all those difficulties at exactly the right time, I would say. So it was like, it's the pandemic. People are already talking about this. The Arts Council, who have funded this project, they want educational projects. So I'll make an educational project. They want digital skills being taught to people. So I'll make a digital project, and I'll try and involve as many people as possible. And institutions want educational projects that enliven their collections, that speak to their work in their collections. So as well as working here with Wolverhampton, I'm also doing a project with MIMA, Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, who have a piece in their collection. And we've been doing educational workshops, and then we're creating an artwork that will be shown on the building facade there. So it's the benefit of understanding what's going on.
Could I add one more thing, which I really sort of admire about your project, Aphra, is that it's deeply rooted in Shemza's work. Because what you're doing is you are interpreting that one circle, one square, one puzzle, and you're extending it to the world. Just, in a way, it's a really hopeful gesture, which is saying, no, it's not just your problem to solve. It's a collective problem. And I think I find that really touching.
Thank you, Hammad.
And hopefully the future. So I think that's a really good note to, please pardon my cough, note to end on. But before we end, I'd really like to thank Wolverhampton Art Gallery for hosting this. It's been a great afternoon. Lini O'Dyer, who's here, I believe, who's been really at the back, thank you, been really helpful, done an awful lot of work towards making this event a success. And also Ruth Stanway, who introduced at the beginning, and thank you as well. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you've enjoyed the afternoon.